Welcome everyone. There is, for those of you who are standing, there is an overflowing room in one of the classrooms downstairs in the ground room. If rather than standing all night, you want to sit and then just watch it. It'll be streamed downstairs. So it'll be for tonight and then also for the weekend. So I'm Father Antonio Lopez. I'm the dean of the John Paul II Institute. I just wanted to give you a warm word of welcome and thank His Eminence Cardinal George for having come from snowy Chicago here to help us lead this conference, open it with his presentation. I also would like to welcome His Excellency Vigano, our Apostolic Nuncio, and President Garvey. I was told he is here. I haven't met him, but he's run away with the folder. So, there you are. Good. The only thing my commitment, my task tonight is very simple. I want to read to you the letter that Monsignor Angelo Becciu, the substitute of the Secretary of State, sent on behalf of Benedict XVI when we informed him that this conference was going to take place. And then afterwards we present Mr. Carl Anderson and I'll be gone. The Holy Father conveys to the organizers and to all taking part his greetings and his cordial good wishes for the occasion. His Holiness is confident that the conference will contribute to a fuller appreciation of the Council's continuing relevance for the renewal of the Church's witness to the Gospel in our time. He trusts that a reappropriation of the great legacy of the Council within a hermeneutic of continuity will help to usher the whole Church into a time of particular reflection and rediscovery of the faith in all its beauty, Catholicity, and illuminative power, and thus serve the urgent needs of the new evangelization. With these sentiments, the Holy Father commends all those assembled in Washington to the loving intercession of Mary, Mother of the Church, and willingly imparts his apostolic blessing as a pledge of wisdom, joy, and peace in the Lord. Professor Carl Anderson has served as Vice President of the Washington session of the John Paul II Institute since its founding in 1988 and was its dean until 1998. Since 1983, he has also taught as a visiting professor at the Institute session, the Central Session, at the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome. Professor Anderson is also the Supreme Knight, which means the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Knights of Columbus. From 83 to 87, he served in the Executive Office of President Ronald Reagan, in various positions, including a special assistant to the President. For nearly a decade, Professor Anderson served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. In 1998, he was appointed by His Holiness Pope John Paul II to the Pontifical Academy for Life, also appointed as an auditor to the 2001 World Synod of Bishops. Professor Anderson currently serves as a member of the Pontifical Council for the Laity and as a consultor to the Pontifical Council for the Family and the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. He's published a number of books. I abbreviate, it could be very long, so I abbreviate. He's published a few books, one with Father Jose Granados, a book that is very dear and important to us, Call to Love, Approaching John Paul II's Theology of the Body, and then his own A Civilization of Love, What Every Catholic Can Do to Transform the World. And most recently, his latest book is Beyond a House Divided, the moral consensus ignored by Washington. With this, please join me in welcoming Mr. Anderson.
Thank you very much, Father. May it please Your Eminence, Your Excellency, Reverend Monsignors, Fathers, President Garvey, my colleagues on the faculty, students. At the close of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI expressed his great hope for its influence on the life of the Church. May it rise as a new spark of divine charity in our hearts, Pope Paul said, a spark which may enkindle the principles, doctrines, and proposals which the Council has organized and which, thus inflamed by charity, may really produce in the Church and in the world that renewal of thoughts, activities, conduct, moral force, and hope and joy, which was the very scope of the Council. How appropriate his words are for us today. We gather not as historians recounting an historic event from a distant, finished past, but as those who value the Second Vatican Council as something far greater. As Catholics, we gather as sons and daughters of the Council. We gather as part of a living church, whose Lord is the Lord of history, both past and future, and who is also, as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger has written, who is a contemporary with us, even as we are his contemporaries. Today we bring to this conference what Paul VI could not, the experience of 40 years about how the Council's work has been received, and especially from the perspective of two great popes whose clear intention has been the implementation of its principles, doctrine, and proposals. Today, through the initiatives of our present Holy Father, we are opening an important chapter in the pastoral mission of the Church under the title of the New Evangelization, an initiative to bring us closer to that hope and joy about which Pope Paul spoke. And yet, if we are about to enter this new chapter in the evangelical work of the Church, we do so in large measure to answer in a more determined way the challenge which confronted the Council itself at its closing. In commenting upon the vision of the Council and of its proposal to the modern world, Pope Paul said this: "Is it a dream? Is it poetry? Is it only a conventional and meaningless exaggeration, as often happens in our day-to-day expression of good wishes? No, this greeting is ideal, but not unreal." And the Pope continued, "When we men push our thoughts and our desires towards an ideal conception of life, we find ourselves immediately in utopia, in rhetorical caricature, in illusion or delusion. Man preserves an unquestionable yearning toward ideal and total perfection, but of himself he is incapable of reaching it, perhaps not in concept or much less with experience or with reality. This we know. It is the drama of man. It is the drama of the fallen king. This drama of the fallen king applies in some ways to all of us, both inside and outside the Church. But this drama also compels us to understand the pastoral challenge confronting the faith today in terms of an adequate anthropology in light of the teaching of the Council. In establishing the Pontifical Council for promoting the new evangelization, Pope Benedict quoted from his predecessor's encyclical Christi Fideis Laici. "Without doubt, a mending of the Christian fabric of society is urgently needed in all parts of the world. But for this to come about, what is needed is to first remake the Christian fabric of the ecclesial community itself." Pope John XXIII was reportedly to have observed that the Second Vatican Council was needed in order to throw open the windows of the church so that the church could see out and the world could see in. That observation has been used to justify many things since the Second Vatican Council. But one may also see in it a key to understanding the work of the new evangelization. What does remaking the Christian fabric of church and society look like? Pope John XXIII spoke of the need to open the windows of the church. Pope John Paul II began his papacy by saying, "Open wide the doors to Christ." Renewal in the church and mending the Christian fabric of our society is a task with personal implications that leads us to a consideration of evangelization in which every Christian is both the object and the subject of evangelization. And thus we find that an adequate anthropology is inseparable from our consideration of an adequate ecclesiology of the council. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger gave us a vivid presentation of this relationship when he spoke about the ecclesiology of the council in 2001. He said this: "The church grows from within and moves outwards, not vice versa. Above all, she is the sign of the most intimate communion with Christ, and she is formed spiritually in a life of prayer, the sacraments, and the fundamental attitudes of faith, hope, and love. Thus, if someone should ask, 'What must I do to become church and to grow like the church?' the reply must be, you must become a person who lives faith, hope, and charity." The world continues to confront the church today with the same question with which it confronted the council at its closing. Is it possible to live in the way that you say? And that question cannot simply be answered by words in a classroom or a lecture hall. It can only be convincingly answered when those words are reflected in the lives of believers. This applies especially to the Christian family, and it applies precisely to the theme of our conference, keeping the world awake to God. Addressing the Pontifical Council for the Family last December, Pope Benedict highlighted the vital place of the family in the new evangelization. The new evangelization depends largely, he said, upon the domestic church. Just as the eclipse of God and the crisis of the family are linked, so the new evangelization is inseparable from the Christian family. The family is indeed the way of the church because it is the human space for our encounter with Christ. The family founded on the sacrament of marriage is a particular realization of the church, saved and saving, evangelized and evangelizing, radiant, that shows the world the love and presence of Christ. In these words, we see clearly why it is that this conference should be sponsored by the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family, and why it is financially underwritten by the Knights of Columbus. The promise of the council and the promise of a new evangelization can be realized when the splendor of Christ truly radiates in the lives of millions of Christian families. Each Christian family that opens wide its doors to Christ and which becomes a place where God can act becomes also a place where his splendor is witnessed. And through these millions of little family cultures of faith, we can mend the fabric of society and strengthen the church in a way that I think is very well described in our speaker this evening's book, God in Action. There, Cardinal George writes, "It is God who makes all things new, because only God can create something from nothing. God does not rearrange the furniture of the present social, economic, and political orders. he provides the very being of a human race that deserves respect in all circumstances, but enjoys eternal life only when transformed by God's grace. In every age and every place, the most important activity is to watch for God's. And thus we are privileged to have with us the author of these words to begin our consideration of the task of keeping the world awake to God. We are indeed glad to have Cardinal George here with us tonight because, like the Council itself, his work, experience, and insights spans numerous areas of the Church. In the second year of the Second Vatican Council, Cardinal George was ordained a priest of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. A decade later, after 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in philosophy and theology, he served in Rome as the Vicar General of the Oblates, where he obtained a doctorate of sacred theology. In 1990, he was ordained Bishop of Yakima, where we worked together as he was state chaplain of the Knights of Columbus, and later he was appointed Archbishop of Portland, and finally Archbishop of his hometown of Chicago in 1997. A year later, he was named a cardinal by Pope John Paul II. In 2008, Cardinal George became president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and in addition to his extensive work there, as president of the conference, he was appointed by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict to several pontifical councils and congregations, including the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples and the Pontifical Council for Culture. In 1990, the year in which our institute in Washington awarded its first graduate degrees, Father Francis George published his doctoral dissertation under the title Enculturation and Ecclesial Communion, Culture and Church in the Teaching of Pope John Paul II. With this book, Father George not only provided our faculty with an extraordinary exposition of the thought of Pope John Paul II, but he quickly became one of the most important contributors to the intellectual life of the Catholic Church in the United States. Your Eminence, thank you for being with us this evening, and welcome.
Thank you, Supreme Knight Carl Anderson, for your very kind words and for the many things that the Knights do, including this institute, and the way in which the work of the Church would be severely impaired were it not for the Knights of Columbus, especially under your leadership. And I'm honored that Archbishop Vigano is with us this evening, the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States, as well, of course, President Garvey, the president of this university, and a very distinguished scholar and interested in the legal dimensions of the relationship between church and state. To some extent, I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about a number of things. I'm very pleased also to see Monsignor Sokolowski, who teaches us all how to think. And I talk about a number of things because it's a huge topic, and I hope that it'll be a benefit as you move towards the rest of the program. I'm honored again to be invited to be at this conference at its beginning, and sorry that I won't be able to follow much of it except as it's published later on. But I am grateful for this invitation and most of all grateful for your presence. What I thought I might do is to speak first of all about the purpose that John the 23rd articulated in calling the council. The document Humanae Salutis, where he talks about convoking the council, is already 50 years old. It was published on December 25th, 1961. And it's not a document that is referred to as frequently as it ought to be, I believe, in trying to understand why the council was called, because if we look at that document more carefully, it places much of the rest of the work in perspective. The document that shows the thinking of John the 23rd issued into the topic that most exercises people in thinking about the Second Vatican Council, and that is the church in the world. And so that will be the second topic I will try to address in cursory fashion. Finally, the church in her own governance, so that she can be Christ's instrument in better fashion in the world, and then the church in her worship of God. Sacrosanctum Concilium was the first of the council documents, and the present Holy Father, in talking about the priority of God being restored, has brought us back to not just a different hermeneutic in interpreting the council, but rather an attention to the way in which the council documents, particularly the four major constitutions, speak about the priority of God, and begin there rather than with ourselves or even with the church, although the council was, as Pope John Paul II said, an exercise in ecclesial self-consciousness. Our worship, of course, at this moment is marked by the reception, finally, 10 years after its publication, of the third edition of the post-conciliar Pauline Roman Missal in a new translation. I had something to do with that translation from time to time, and if you notice the word oblation, Mr. Anderson talked about my being an oblate of Mary Immaculate. That's not a common word in English. But if you notice how often it comes up in the translation, know that each time the word oblation was there, it was a battle between myself, who was the U.S. representative to ISIL, and Bishop Crosby, who is the Canadian, or was the Canadian representative to ISIL, who's also an oblate of Mary Immaculate. And one of our primary concerns in convincing the other 9 members of ISIL from other parts of the world was to say, oblation means self-sacrifice, so you can't just translate it by sacrifice. So each time that you see that word, I chuckle, and I invite you to recognize that there's a history behind every one of those words, and that's one that's particularly important to me. Anyway, then the last thing I'll do is talk about the Church's communion a little bit, based also on the encyclical of Paul VI, Ecclesiam Suam, that he wrote during the council, and that I think is a marvelous summary of the methodology of the council, which is that of dialogue. And finally, a few words about the promised springtime. What impedes the ecclesial self-consciousness, it weakens it, that was called for by the council, a new sense of who we are as church. And then what in the signs of the times, if you like, in the last 50 years, would strengthen that new sense of ecclesial self-consciousness that is in part the fruit of the council and the world in which we now live as Catholic believers. So let me begin then with Humanae Salutis and the purpose of calling the council. When John the 23rd issued this apostolic constitution to convoke the council for some time in 1962, sometime in the next year, without giving the date at this point, he started with the missionary mandate of Jesus. The mandate to preach the gospel to all peoples, and to remember that the Redeemer of the world comforted his disciples and us as well by saying, "Behold, I am with you all days, even unto the consummation of the world. Have faith, for I have overcome the world." If we're going to talk about the relationship between church and world, we should understand how John the 23rd looked at both the church and the world. In this same document, Humanae Salutis, he gives an analysis of the world as a place of grave crisis. One of the more tragic periods of history, even at the beginning of a new era, was marked now by a great disunity among the peoples of the world. A history that had been marked in recent decades by war and fratricide, by Nazism and racism, by communism and class warfare, had forgotten not only God, it had forgotten that we are one human family. And so he asked the question, if we have confidence in the Savior of the world, and if we take up the mission of the church, which is to introduce the world to its Savior in every age until he returns again in glory, then what is it incumbent upon the church to do? And what he said was the church should use her own internal unity as a leaven in order to restore the unity of the human race. That's not often a sense of purpose of the council that is heard. We've sometimes interpreted the calling of the council to have the church catch up with the world, and in a sense, that's not totally false. It is to understand what the world is and understand how we have to change to talk to the world, if indeed we are to introduce the world to its Savior. But primarily, he was so convinced of the internal unity of the church and of its own strength that he thought all he had to do, not all he had to do, but basically what the church had to do, was to make that unity present to a divided world, and that would be, in its own way, attractive enough to bring people into a new form of relationship. Talking about the church, it has strengthened itself socially in unity. It has been reinvigorated intellectually. It has been interiorly purified and is thus ready for trial. The church will come together and contemplate itself in its own awe-inspiring unity. In the same way, it feels more urgent the duty to give greater efficiency to its sound vitality and to promote the sanctification of its members. This will be a demonstration of the church to a world which is lost, confused, and anxious under the constant threat of new frightful conflicts. In this situation, the forthcoming council must offer a possibility for all men and women of goodwill to turn their thoughts and their intentions toward peace, towards unity, towards fraternity. That is a sense in the Pope's own heart of why he was calling a council. The world was a terrible mess because it wasn't united. The church had a very strong internal unity, and therefore we should use that unity as a leaven through dialogue, not through imposition, to unify the world. If we do that well, he thought the human race would begin to see itself as a human family, as brothers and sisters, and eventually as a people of God. In other words, as believers who understand why they truly are a family. At the end of the document, he says very clearly, in ways that I would like to repeat now, what is the aim of the council. Venerable brothers, this is not that Humanae Salutis, it's his opening speech, the much-quoted opening speech about prophets of doom. Venerable brothers, such is the aim of the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, which, while bringing together the Church's best energies and striving to have men welcome more favorably the good tidings of salvation, prepares, as it were, and consolidates the path toward that unity of mankind, which is required as a necessary foundation in order that the earthly city may be brought to the resemblance of that heavenly city where truth reigns, charity is the law, and whose extent is eternity. That's the purpose of the council. It means that the ecclesiology of the council, which we'll talk about briefly as an ecclesiology of communion, of relationships, becomes then the means of establishing human solidarity. Again, the internal unity of the church as communion should establish the external unity of the human race in solidarity, nations and cultures and people with one another. The council, therefore, was truly an exercise in ecclesial self-consciousness, as John Paul II explained it from the viewpoint of his own philosophical anthropology. But if that is true, then how is the church going to change her self-consciousness in order to be the instrument for changing the world? How does the church situate herself in the world so that she can be, as the first paragraph of Lumen Gentium, the decree on the church, says, the sacrament of the unity of the human race? With that purpose in mind, we should look, I think, at a couple of points, and we only have time for a few, on the church in the world where, as the Pope now likes to say, there is continuity of principle, but in changed circumstances, the principles sometimes take on a different cast as well. There is a development of doctrine in the Second Vatican Council. It was a reform council, which means some things changed. What changed was our sense of the church. It wasn't radically different in the sense that it contradicted what was there before, but it certainly did complete it. The great ecclesiologist after the Council of Trent and in the midst of the Protestant Reformation was, of course, Robert Bellarmine. But he was building on the work of jurists from the time of the 14th century. The church didn't become self-conscious in the way that she is now, because, first of all, she wasn't born in a modern age, which is by definition self-conscious, subjectively intense, but also because the early councils, as you know, were concerned about the mystery of the Godhead in the Trinity, of the person and natures of Christ. And then as the way of life of many, many Christians, including the papal court, was separated more and more from the way of life that we see modeled in the gospel, you had the Reform councils, the Lateran councils, and eventually you had the Reformation itself because of the scandal of the church's faithful not living in conformity to what they were professing as they proclaimed the gospel. But the danger of schism predated the Reformation, and so it was answered in juridical terms by the medieval jurists. The first was James of Viterbo in the first years of the 14th century, who wrote the first treatise in ecclesiology in any explicit way. And because Bellarmine was working out of that juridical framework for understanding the church as a society, a visible society, and because the reformers were saying the structures of the church are adventitious, it doesn't matter really what form the governance of the church takes. The church is invisible. She is the work of grace and of the infused virtues of faith and hope and charity, all of which is very true. But because they put aside and relativized and almost forgot about the structures of the church, the reaction to that on the part of Cardinal Bellarmine was to define the church as a perfect society, like the state. Not morally perfect any more than the state is morally perfect, but perfect in the sense that she had everything she needed to fulfill her mission from Christ, just as the state had everything that it needs in order to fulfill its mission in this world. So the church is a perfect society, a complete society, having all that is necessary for her mission, and he described her constitutional elements. Bellarmine's work defined church authority and its limits, and gave these a basis in scripture and tradition. The rights and duties of different classes of church members were clarified. In a sense, the church was examined almost from the outside, as if by an observer. The analogy was the kingdom of France, the kingdom of Naples. It is that visible reality, and that was the controlling metaphor. And that meant that governance was legitimated by jurisdiction, by the legal power to act. And it left the church with the modern dilemma until the Second Vatican Council. How do you separate the domains of church and the new nation states coming out of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648? Both are perfect societies, both are complete, both have their rights. How do you separate the domains, and more than that, how do you get them to cooperate? And so there were various theological theories of subordination of state to church and of liberty of action, etc. But what was clear was that that was a theology of church that left us in an impasse, at least when we wanted to think about the church in the world, the subject of the Second Vatican Council. Before the council, Pope Pius XII already began, with the help of many German theologians in the 19th century, to get outside of that juridical framework of the perfect society based upon jurisdiction into a theology of church that was based upon the biblical metaphors that are so evident to those who want to examine what the church is by beginning with the way she's described in the New Testament. The church in these metaphors is related to Christ and the Holy Spirit as a mystery of faith, and in 1943, Pope Pius XII used the metaphor of the mystical body of Christ to define the church's nature from the sources of her life, from within, as we just heard Pope Benedict XVI say. The Pope wrote to combat the false notion that there are two different churches, an interior or spiritual church of all who believe in Christ, and an external, visibly structured church, which can be analyzed without reference to her nature as a mystery of faith. He overcame ecclesial dualism by identifying the mystical body of Christ with the society and structures of the Roman Catholic Church, without overlap. The famous subsisted in paragraph in Lumen Gentium tries to say exactly that, but a little bit more. There are elements of ecclesiality outside of the visible structures of the Catholic Church, and these relate people to the Church in ways that salvation is still available. They're called vestigia ecclesiae, vestiges of the Church. Outside of the visible Catholic Church, nonetheless, there are elements of ecclesiality that do relate people, whether they know it or not, to the Church, include them in a certain sense, her membership in such a way that it is possible to dialogue with them, to see something in them that is also in us, to see them as friends and as fellow believers, to recognize a common baptism. It's the same kind of thinking that in the missiological, the mission document, saw semina verbi, the seeds of the word, in natural religions and in non-Christian religions, so that, again, missionaries could dialogue with people of other faiths or of no faith at all, because there are the seeds of the word present, because God created the world, and the world, therefore, is good in its own structure. So it was this looking for whether vestiges of the church or seeds of the word that enabled the Second Vatican Council to say that in the end, we are already brothers and sisters, although not everybody realizes it, and therefore we should be the ones to initiate dialogue to the extent that that is possible. In a very clever way, therefore, Vatican II finessed the whole question of the church and the world as it was restricted to the question of the relationship between church and state, which is still the way we very often speak of it in this country, unfortunately. What did she do instead? She talked about the relationship between faith and culture. The most provocative and original sections of the great document Constitution Gaudium et Spes, the Church in the Modern World, are those sections, the middle sections on culture, which isn't too well defined, but nonetheless what she did was, let's talk about two perfect societies, let's talk about two normative systems. Because who we are in our culture is far more important than who we are in our citizenship. And since both faith and culture are normative, and both are complete, and both tell us what is important, and both tell us what to think, and both tell us how to act, indeed, if we want to be in the world as a leaven, then we should engage cultures. And that's far more important than trying to engage states. And therefore, the whole legal approach, both to the internal understanding of who the church is and to her relationship to the world through the institutions of the state, while still there and still important, we are citizens and we are a visible society, nonetheless becomes secondary. This relationship, that is a very clever move. I mean, every time I think about it, I kind of chuckle again, like when I see oblation in the liturgy. That relationship between church and the world is set by dialogue, and so therefore, the church, the Council Fathers, rather, were concerned about the conditions for authentic dialogue, and to have an authentic dialogue between the church and the culture, in order to properly situate the church in the world in a new age, we have to speak about the freedom of the church. And so there was that very small decree about the freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. Freedom of religion, I don't think I'll bother to read the quote from the beginning. Right from the very beginning of Dignitatis Humanae, they define what freedom of religion means. And it's a very fine quote. We sometimes think in this country that that was the product of the work of John Courtney Murray. It certainly was at the Council, but it wasn't the offshoot of his famous articles in Theological Studies in the 1950s, which was an institutional approach to the question, saying that in a country where the state is omnipresent and is really, without being necessarily totalitarian, nonetheless quite holistic in its approach to citizens, then of course you have to have some kind of intrinsic relationship between church and state, because the state otherwise wouldn't permit the church to be free. But in our kind of limited government, with our Constitution, the state is much more controlled and contained within its own domain, and therefore it leaves free the domain of everything else. Our culture, we don't have a minister of culture, as European states have. Our religion, etc., we don't have a minister of religion. So therefore, in that case, you have an institutional difference, and the church's juridical understanding of that relationship doesn't hold in our kind of limited government situation. That may or may not be true. It was an interesting analysis, but what the document on the religious freedom in the modern world says is that it starts rather not from an institutional consideration, but from an anthropological consideration. Who are we as free people, men and women made in God's image and likeness, and therefore necessarily exercising our religious duties and doing that, expressing our religious beliefs in such a way that the state itself must permit that to go on, along with the society in general, the culture in which we live. The dignity of the human person is therefore the foundation for that document, and it goes on then to talk also about institutional freedom, but begins rather with the anthropological turn that is so much a part of the conciliar documents. The document on freedom of religion also talks about freedom of conscience, but it talks about freedom of conscience vis-a-vis the state, not vis-a-vis the church. And this, too, is an important point, I think, because freedom of conscience means you have the right to act on your conscience, and you do, always. Conscience is a practical principle in Catholic moral teaching. But it certainly does not mean that you have the right to deny what God has revealed in Christ and still call yourself a believer. Sometimes freedom of conscience is understood as a function of the sovereign self in our kind of individualistic society, and means that people have a right, by reason of the Church's teaching herself, to deny what is declared by the Church as authentically revealed and still call themselves a believer in good standing. Freedom of conscience is not something that is understood within the community of faith in the same way that it is understood within the civil community. It must be respected totally in the civil community. Within the community of faith, it must be respected. You can act as you like, but you can't then say that you're doing that precisely as a Catholic believer because you've denied something that the Church says is revealed. And then you become a church of one. Thomas Aquinas says that very well. If you believe every article of the Creed but one, you don't believe any of them, because you have made yourself, your sovereign intelligence, and your sovereign will the criterion of what God has revealed, instead of believing it's revealed because God has revealed it and he is trustworthy. So the document doesn't go into that very clearly, and that might be part of the reason why we are in some of the problems that we've got now. But nonetheless, those are two elements where the consideration of the Church in the world, the superseding of the church-state distinction that still unfortunately dominates our own understanding of the relationship between religion and world in this country, and the profound understanding of freedom of religion as an anthropological imperative among people who are created in God's image and likeness. Those are areas of the Church's teaching that build on what was there before, but certainly give it a different shift. There's not simple continuity. There is a reform. There is a principle that is identified justly so, but worked out in a very different way because the circumstances have changed. If, in fact, the Church in the world has to change, then we should ask the question, thirdly, about the Church in her own governance. And if the theology of communion is the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, that is, the Church is a network of relationships, first of all, founded upon the exchange of gifts. First of all, gifts of divine life, so that the Church is a mystery because she brings us into a participation in the life of the Trinity. Then the sharing of the gifts of Christ, particularly the gospel, the seven sacraments, and apostolic governance, but also the invisible gifts. If indeed all those gifts, when they're shared, create relationships, and they do, every time you give somebody a gift, you create a relationship. If your grandmother gives you a gift and you refuse it, you harm that relationship. A gift is a commodity with a person attached, and so you refuse the gift, you refuse the person, and so you break the relationship. Ecclesial communion is a network of relationships based upon sharing the gifts of Christ. Communion among bishops, when we turn to church governance, is called collegiality. And the theological challenge after the council was to situate correctly the relationship between collegiality, primacy, and apostolicity. And that has continued to be a very important element of ecclesiology, and it's being slowly, I think, understood more comprehensively. But something that isn't being understood, I think, very well is the new understanding of the ordained priesthood and consequently the ordained episcopate and its relationship to the sense of holy orders and its relationship to pastoring. We still, I think, work out of what had been a Sulpician, basically, my own order is Sulpician in its spirituality, understanding of the priest that was situated in the ministry of the Incarnation, rather than in the mystery of Christ, not made man, but rather made head of the church. And it's that shift that is still to be assimilated entirely. In fact, the priest is not an alter Christus any more than any baptized person is an alter Christus. We all become other Christ. That is our relationship to the Heavenly Father is changed by sanctifying grace, by the grace that makes us truly sons and daughters of God. In that sense, we are, each of us, other Christs. What is added to the priest by reason of ordination is not the sanctifying grace that comes with baptism, but the sacramental grace that permits him to participate in a different relationship that Christ has, not to the Father, but to the church, as head of the church. That's not a relationship that is necessary for his salvation, but it is necessary for the governance of the church. Why was that an issue? Because St. Thomas Aquinas, in his theology of holy order, stopped with the priest as the one who celebrates the Eucharist. And that was the highest representation of presbyteral reality. What happened then was that there was a long-standing theological discussion whether or not when someone was consecrated a bishop, rather than ordained a bishop, he wasn't participating in the theology or in the reality of holy orders. He was a priest with added jurisdiction. Again, a juridical understanding of the episcopacy. The council settled that by saying very clearly we ordain bishops because that is the completion of the sacrament itself of holy orders. And bishops have authority directly from Jesus Christ by reason of that sacrament to govern the church. It doesn't depend upon the addition of jurisdiction even from the Pope. Before the council, when bishops went to Rome for their ad limina visits, they got what they call quinquennial faculties. They were faculties given by the Holy Father so that they could govern, that they could have jurisdiction in their dioceses. That doesn't happen any longer. You have that authority, every bishop, by reason of his inclusion in the apostolic college with and under Peter, and by reason of the fact that he has received the grace of holy orders. Once again, they took a long-standing theological dilemma, and they finessed it. And they escaped from the question of sacramental power over the Eucharist to pastoral authority over the body of Christ, so that you can celebrate the Eucharist. You can give people the sacramental body of Christ because you have pastoral authority to govern them. The priesthood and the episcopacy, holy orders at those two levels, is a sacrament of church governance. And that insight is, I think, extraordinarily important, even in the calling of men to ordained priesthood. I know when I talk to the seminarians at Mundelein, I ask them the new one, are you called to celibacy? Because the church chooses from among those called to celibacy her priests in the Western Church, in the Latin Rite. We can discuss that back and forth, but that is the fact right now, and it fits. There's reason for it, because if you have the same relationship to the church that Christ has, he's the bridegroom of the church. He's married to the church. It's not definitive, but nonetheless, it is fitting. So the call to celibacy is something that has to be seen in its own dimensions. Otherwise, it becomes simply a cause of resentment. If somebody wants to be a priest, but he doesn't want to be celibate, there's always something gnawing at him. He hasn't accepted celibacy in a way that it will be life-giving. It will be rather a source of anguish for him and perhaps destruction for him. But the second question is, after are you called to celibacy, can you govern? Because you're called as a priest to govern the church. That is, can you be a father? Can you be a husband? Are you at home in the tasks of adult men? If that isn't the case, if you don't think you can govern, no matter how devotional you are, no matter how smart you are, no matter how holy you are, you're not called to ordained priesthood. Can you govern? Because holy orders now is clearly, in the Vatican Council, the way in which Christ, through those who participate in his headship sacramentally, governs his people. Again, something was finessed that had been with us since the Reformation, where the governance was adventitious, was very often in the hands of a lay vestry, and those who were called to ministry rather than to orders did so on the basis of their baptism and their desire to preach the Word of God. That's a very wonderful thing. But in the Catholic perspective, that is lay ministry. It's what we have now in lay ecclesial ministers. It's based upon baptism, and it's a service of various sorts. But governance is something else. And governance, in the apostolic sense, based upon apostolicity from the apostles, is one of the gifts that we share and that make us Catholic, that isn't shared by other ecclesial Christian communities except by the Orthodox. The fourth point, then, would be the church in her worship of God. And after I received this invitation, I decided, because of Pope Benedict XVI's work to help us to understand the council better, to go through the four constitutions and see how it is that, as the Pope says, God is given priority. And, of course, that is clearly so when we worship. You don't worship someone who isn't prior to you. It's interesting if you do that. I'm not going to go through all the quotes. I just mentioned a few of them. But the Pope is right, as he always is. When you look at it from that prism, you can see why the first decree was on liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, because that situates the church in the world because she's well-ordered, well-situated vis-a-vis God, who is creator of the world, its redeemer, and its sanctifier. And so if we're going to be in the world precisely as a mystery, the mystery of ecclesial communion, communion first of all with God, then the way we are in the world is as worshipers of the Father in the Son through the Holy Spirit, who then have a chance to set right the order of the world itself. In her worship of God, the Church discovers also most completely who she truly is. And if you take a look at the various documents, you can see that there was a desire, apart from that purpose we talked about, but behind it, a desire to bring God to human beings and human beings to God. And everything else was seen in that relationship, in that perspective: church, liturgy, mission, communications, dialogue with the culture, etc. And because Jesus Christ is where divinity and humanity meet, then he becomes the form of ecclesial life and the focus of the church's mission, the one who brings together the human family, not only among themselves, but with God himself. The documents, beginning with Sacrosanctum Concilium, talk about adoration and the beginning of it in the way in which Adam had fellowship with God in the Garden of Eden. It's the starting point and the end point of the history of salvation, the culmen et fons of the history of salvation, because as the second paragraph in Sacrosanctum Concilium says, since the liturgy is each day building up those who are within a holy temple in the Lord into a dwelling place for God and the Spirit, it is by the same token also strengthening remarkably their capacity to preach Christ, to introduce the world to its Savior. And so you can't distinguish, you can't separate out worship and mission. They are two different activities, but in fact, you can't have one without the other. And so you go through the constitutions and you can see in which the metaphor about the temple comes back, something perhaps we weren't. So we were very clear early on about people of God, and then we became more sensitive to mystical body or body of Christ. But if you go and see temple of the Spirit, the number of times that comes forth, particularly as they're talking about the stance of adoratio, of men and women walking in friendship with God, and therefore rightly ordered in their own life, and the cosmos rightly ordered with them. And the consequence of sin destroying that relationship with God and his human creatures, and destroying as well the order of nature. The cosmic fall and the cosmic restoration at the end of time are part of the history of salvation. Original sin is an act of faulty worship where you put the ego in the place of God, and we all know that from our own sorry experience. The church then is the holy temple, which is praised by the fathers of the church when they find it represented in sanctuaries made of stone. It's a body, is all interdependent, etc., but interdependent among human beings because all of them depend upon God. And therefore, as they say in Lumen Gentium, all human beings are called to the new people of God. This people, while remaining one and unique, is to be spread throughout the whole world. For all the nations of the earth, there is one people of God, since it draws its citizens from all nations. And what does it do when it draws them into its corporation, its communion, its unity? It shows them how to worship. So you can go through even Gaudium et Spes, reading the signs of the time, as not social trends, but rather as signs of God's activity in the world, and invitations, therefore, to worship him. I'd like to spend just a few moments then summing the whole thing up that I talked about by recalling some of the central themes of the church as communion, a set of relationships based on the sharing of gifts of Christ to his people, beginning with the gift of divine life through baptism, which brings us into the communion of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. The 20th anniversary of Vatican II's dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen, Gentium, occasioned a speech by Pope John Paul II where he said, "The universal church is presented as a communion of churches and indirectly as a communion of nations, languages, cultures. Each of these brings its own gifts to the whole, just as do single human generations and epochs, particular scientific and social gains, and the stages of civilization which are gradually attained. In particular, by reason of that characteristic of universality which adorns and distinguishes her, the Church knows that she must harmonize those gifts in a higher unity in order that they may contribute to the progressive affirmation of Christ's one single kingdom." Another occasion, more philosophically, John Paul II spoke about ecclesial communion being an ontological relationship of reciprocal inclusion. Everybody gives, everybody receives. And in that way, we come to understand what it means to be brothers and sisters in Christ. The bond of Catholic communion, as Catholic, means that the Church is herself everywhere. She's extensively Catholic. It means, more importantly, that the qualitative foundation for this extensive Catholicity is love shared, the communion of persons formed by mutual self-giving. This is intensive Catholicity, and it gives the Church her proper personality. This self-conscious sharing is expressed within the Church in our common profession of faith. It's expressed externally in dialogue with those who do not share this faith. In dialogue, the Church helps all peoples to discover the dignity of each person, and she helps to unite all in a communion of love, which even apart from her own faith, strengthens human solidarity, the unity of the human race. The relationships constituting the communion of the Catholic Church are therefore diverse. The most fundamental are ontological, rooted in the Godhead, and based in persons called to participate in divine life. Some ecclesial relationships are also juridical, so the juridical doesn't disappear. It is properly part of the constitution of the Church. It's not something adventitious. It's not something that we can put aside and rearrange the Church in forms of governance that would make her our own club. No, they come from Christ, but they're juridical and they're external. They're based either on divine institution, such as the relations in the apostolic college, or on ecclesiastical law, such as the patriarchates and the relations which define particular churches in a given territory. Some ecclesial relations are invisible. Some are external, some are both. For example, invisible relations with an external expression. Some relations unite only those in visible ecclesial communion, and some connect believers with those who are not even Christians. Some relations are adventitious, unnecessary for the constitution of the Church, but still part of her lived experience, cultural interchanges, for example. Some, that's what Pope John Paul II used to say, in you, Christ is French. In you, Christ is Chinese. In you, Christ is American. Some relations are themselves symbols, extending the Church's communion beyond normal space and time, making objectively present the divine term that the relation unites us to subjectively. Those relations based on common sharing reinforce equality in ecclesial communion. Thus, all believers share, although not all in the same way, in God's life, in faith and the Eucharist and the other sacraments, in apostolic governance. Since all these are of Christ, all believers share in Christ, prophet, priest, and king. All share also in a common anticipation of his coming again in glory. Those relations, on the other hand, which are based on particular missions or charisms, tend to accentuate differences in ecclesial communion. Thus, the calling to ordained priesthood or episcopacy, the founding of a religious order, the creation of new particular churches, the development of movements for the Church's social action, can all seem to diminish communion by separating groups of believers, unless the differentiation of these groups is articulated relationally to the whole. Therefore, there's not a question of turf, as it was with church and the state. It's rather an organic relationship that makes you distinct and at the same time relates you to everything else. A major, although invisible, source of inequality in ecclesial relationship is the different degrees of love in the hearts of believers. Love, however, cannot threaten communion. I once wrote rather famously, God does not love everyone equally. And you would think I had denied the existence of God. But it's quite clear that God loves the Blessed Virgin Mary more than he loves Francis George. I don't, God loves everyone, but doesn't love everyone equally. So there is both an equality and inequality in the fundamental dimension of the Church's constitution, namely as an exchange of love between God and among ourselves. Lastly, then, just a few last words, I'm not aware of the time. The promised springtime, what happened? Well, First of all, the myth that somehow the popes did not want to implement the council is really dishonest when you take a look at the history of what the popes have done since the council. It's obvious that they have tried very clearly to implement the council, but in different ways according to what they brought to the papacy, what were their personal gifts that they brought. Paul VI was a great curialist. He understood the workings of the Roman Curia perfectly because he spent most of his life in the Roman Curia, except for his time as a residential bishop in Milan, as Archbishop of Milan, the great almost patriarchal see of Milan in northern Italy. What he did was to internationalize the Curia quite deliberately. He created new rules for the way in which the various dicasteries interact so that it would be a body that was more supple and more able to respond to the needs of the people of God. He created the Roman Synod of Bishops, which is a permanent entity outside of the Curia, and that is a way of bringing in bishops in an exercise of collegiality outside of an ecumenical council in a pastoral and administrative instrument that enables us to talk across a lot of other divisions. He was someone who took very seriously the theology of communion. As I said, he wrote his first encyclical, Ecclesiam Suum, on that, anticipating the ecclesiology of the council and contributing to it. But he took that into church governance, particularly. John Paul II took that theology of communion into the church's mission in an extraordinary fashion. He implemented the council by preaching who Christ is, which is the mission of the church in every age, in all the cultures of the earth, and doing it in such a way that he tried to show the organic unity of believers because they are gathered into ecclesial communion, no matter what other divisions or historical animosities there might be among peoples. And Benedict XVI has restored to its priority, and in our own consciousness as church, the worship of God in spirit and in truth. He recapitulates the entire tradition in his masterful catechesis and other writings in such a way that we can situate the council as a true development in the sense of reform, in the sense of some change, but continuity of principle, and therefore be at ease with the council, so that the council itself is not a further source of division in a church which was supposed to use its internal unity in order to bring the world to Christ. So the popes have tried to implement it, each one according to his own personal charism and gifts, and there's still much to be done. The two questions, if we're talking about the springtime, would be what weakens ecclesial self-consciousness, this new self-consciousness as related, as in communion, that comes out of all the work of the council, and what strengthens it. What weakens it, first of all, is a political interpretation of the council in terms of liberal and conservative, because the division between liberal and conservative is a modern division in the last 400 years that situates people vis-a-vis authority, not vis-a-vis truth. And so liberals have a tendency to be critical of authority, conservatives have a tendency to safeguard it, and we work out our political life by compromises between the two camps. But the church is concerned not about liberal and conservative, but about true and false. And if the analysis remains at the level of politics, then we lose the council, we lose the faith, in fact. It wasn't about the exercise of authority. It was about the way in which the truths revealed by God could be made far more available to the contemporary world by changing the church enough to make her a better dialogue partner with everyone in the world. That kind of divisiveness takes away from the Catholicity of the church and introduces into the internal life of the church the very divisions of the world that the council was intent upon overcoming, transcending. More than that, it paralyzes the mission, for you can't do something if you're of two minds. And so as long as you have a stalemate, you simply stop. What else can you do? And so by introducing that kind of analysis into the council's history, we paralyze the very mission that was the reason for calling the council in the first place. That is something that weakens and is a disservice to the work of the Holy Spirit through the Second Vatican Council. Secondly, when we talk about what weakens the new sense of self-consciousness that should be ours as members of the Catholic Church because of the Second Vatican Council. In this particular society, but in a lot of Western societies in general, maybe elsewhere too, there is a growing opposition to the Church's moral teaching. You know, after Christmas, we celebrated the first martyr, St. Stephen, who was stoned because to the Jewish people, he said Jesus was greater than Moses. So that was a religious reason for being opposed to Catholicism. And after that, the death of the Holy Innocents, who were killed because they threatened a king, at least you thought he was threatened by their existence. And then Thomas à Becket, who was killed because Henry II thought that he wasn't permitting the king to control the church, to have the church in his kingdom the way he wanted it to be in his kingdom. There are all kinds of reasons for opposing Catholicism. On December 18th, 22 members of my own congregation were beatified in Madrid. They were seminarians for the most part, and a few of their professors and the provincial were simply taken out of their religious house, lined up and shot. No trial, no anything else, because that was the condition of the Spanish Civil War, and the church was the object of great hatred for different reasons. Now, however, the opposition to the church is primarily based upon her moral teaching, whether it is the protection of life through abortion, whether it is the nature of human sexuality and its gift. It is something that elicits a lot of antagonism and that prevents the anthropological turn that was one of the gifts of John Paul II's thinking, enriching Catholic theology with the phenomenological and anthropological analysis that was new to the papal magisterium. In such a way that you can't discover who you are by looking at Christ, and the way of the church can't be man, the human being, as John Paul II said, if, in fact, in a post-Freudian culture, all of our identity is so bound up with our sexualization that nothing else can break in. And when that happens, the council is stymied. And so it has happened to a great extent in our society, and it's something of a reaction to perhaps a kind of repression that existed before, but it's not a civilized country unless there is some way of controlling otherwise unbridled human sexual activity. And the fact that we would say that freedom now demands that kind of sexual freedom means that the church's moral teaching becomes an object of disdain and even at times of hatred. And so there's a constant search for finding ways to express things differently, since much of our moral theology, particularly around the protection of life and around the nature of the gift of human sexuality, is also based upon natural moral law. The comment that Pope Benedict XVI made when he spoke to the Bundestag in his recent trip to Germany is very interesting, and I'm surprised in a way that more haven't taken it up. Arguing against legal positivism with Kelsen, who was quite influential in German legal theory apparently, arguing against legal positivism, he talked about the natural moral law, but he talked about it not by an analysis of the natural end of an activity, which is the usual way in, or else a moral virtue which is protected by our activity or subverted by it, but he talked about it as a moral theory that expresses a human ecology. In other words, he was saying that natural moral law can be expressed not so much or not only in terms of ends, can also be expressed in terms of relationships, which of course would come right out of the Second Vatican Council, although it didn't go into that kind of natural law theory in the council itself. And at some point, I would like to have the freedom to talk to him and ask him, what did you have in mind when you just simply dropped that sentence and then went on to the rest of your speech? But it's an interesting thing. Thirdly, besides the growing opposition of the Church's reality, the Church's mission because of her moral teaching, there is a militant atheism, not based on communism now, on Marxism, but rather on secularism. And that it means that we forget God, and when we forget God, we forget ourselves, we forget who we are as human beings, and we forget being itself, as the Pope often says. So the political interpretation of the Council, the growing opposition to the Church by reason of her moral teaching, the militant atheism, all of those would militate against our having an easy understanding of ourselves as part of this network of ecclesial relationships that we call communion. Isn't there something that would therefore, lead us to think, well, we're on our way, there will be a springtime? I think that there is, in the generosity of spirit, that is to me more and more evident. Inclusivity is a secular term, but it can be used to mean Catholic. And it's impossible now to live with a very restricted consciousness. When I was growing up, people lived in their parish, they lived in their city. I lived in a big city at the time, fairly big city, bigger then than it is now, Chicago. But you could live there without being concerned about people at the other end of the globe. We don't have that luxury anymore. And that's very good, that there's a global consciousness that is born of the Apollo 8 mission, seeing the globe in a very precarious state, lost in that infinite sea of black space. There is, among younger people, yourselves I imagine certainly more than I, an enlarged consciousness that has elicited in many people a great generosity of spirit. And where there's generosity of spirit, there is God. God is supremely generous. God is love. And sometimes the generosity goes beyond generosity to self-sacrifice. People give their time. Last night I was with a group of young people who come to Chicago. We run a house called the Mate House, and they give a whole year of their life in community. They're all college graduates, and they work with the poor in some of our institutions, some of our schools, a lot of things. They just simply give their time, and that's all we have is time. And so it's very generous. And then they often go into a way of life that continues to call them to ever greater generosity. So I think there is a real growth in generosity of spirit based upon a broadened, enlightened global consciousness that is part of the development of the human race now. And that can only bode well for this future of an all-inclusive communion, which is what the Church is supposed to be the sacrament of. Finally, in terms of what I think is going to continue to work us toward the springtime, is the ongoing reform of the liturgy, which is at the heart of this Pope's magisterium, because it's the heart of his life. And the somewhat aberrational principles at times that willy-nilly were brought into the liturgical reform, saying at the surface, are now being re-examined, and we're going down deeper, it seems to me, and that with the ongoing reform of the liturgy, going back to Sacrosanctum Concilium, the very first document, I think there will be a new springtime. There is already, because we'll be worshiping God in spirit and in truth, and truly therefore be his people, the people of God. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cardinal George, for a very helpful lecture. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If there are any, so just please raise your hand, and then call upon you. Please.
You can ask anybody else questions too, I think, can't you? Isn't that? But anyway.
Your Eminence, thank you for coming tonight. My question is, you mentioned towards the end of your talk the current Holy Father's liturgical reform. I was wondering how you feel that the Suorum Pontificum and the existence of two forms within the one Roman Rite should influence our continual development and understanding of the liturgical reforms following the Second Vatican Council.
I think the words that the Holy Father gave us, ordinary, the Missal of Paul VI, and extraordinary, the last edition in 1962 of the Roman Missal under John XXIII, with the reforms of Pius XII, the reforms, particularly the Triduum, in that Missal. I think that's an indication of that relationship as we move forward. I think it's very clear the Holy Father would like us to remember and also to worship in that form, with the hope that the reverence that is often part of it, and the clear adoration that it is of God, will influence the celebration of the ordinary form, along with the recapturing of a lot of the idiom that is in the Missal of Paul VI, but that was excised in the translation of the first edition of the Roman Missal. So I think it's a question of, it's a symbiotic relationship. They're both expressions of the Roman Rite, they're developments. Neither is the same rite, word for word, as St. Justin Martyr celebrated it, but both of them have those elements there. And so I think if we celebrate both, most people will use the ordinary means, I think, even those who were raised at a time when they could remember what it was to celebrate using the rite, so-called Tridentine rite. But there's a great advantage to that, or at least to having people go once in a while to that. A lot of people do find it very helpful in their adoring God. And finally, that's the goal. It's not a question you celebrate this rite or that rite. The goal is what helps you best to adore God. They're both celebrations of the Mass, the Eucharist. Sometimes it's useful to go to, the Liturgy of John Chrysostom or the Antiochian Rite, just because, in the Maronite Church, in the Antiochian Rite, there's nothing more spectacularly moving than when everybody, priest included, goes on their knees and they recite the words of consecration in Aramaic. I mean, it's bone-chilling. So every once in a while, it's good to see something else. But the normal rite, the ordinary rite, is what we've got in its translation of the third edition of the Roman Missal. But the Church has a long memory, and she has a tradition that unites her. It's a living tradition to Christ. But that tradition, well, it's essential, is surrounded by history. And so there are historical elements that it's good to remember, too, as we move along. The living tradition is safe. It's safe in the Tridentine Rite. It's safe in the Pauline Missal. But the history is different. And so it's good to be reminded, good to bear that in mind. That's how I see it. Anyway. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
He talks about social interaction, doing social things together, and praying together.
Yes.
Leaving theological dialogues out of that, leaving that to the theologians. And I'm talking about as it applies to the laypersons. Do you agree with what he is saying? And how would that apply to a prayer and social actions? How would one relate to evangelicals, for example, the ones who were talking with
Evangelicals and Catholics together? Yeah, that started when I was a new bishop in 1990. Well, there are all kinds of questions there, aren't there? I agree with Cardinal Casper about spiritual ecumenism, of course. That is, that finally, unity is a gift. It's not something that we can negotiate. It's not based upon seeing that certain interests are met and then creating a compromise, as would be the case in contracts or non-communal kind of things in government and in commerce. So it's a gift, and therefore we have to pray for it. So in that sense, all ecumenism is spiritual, and we have to wait patiently for the gift to be clarified for us, because right now we don't see how it's possible. The obstacles in Christian ecumenism are different. They're more historical than dogmatic. With the Orthodox, we have different histories. We read historical events differently. We remember different events. The fall of Constantinople is very clear in their mind. We don't think about it hardly at all. So we have to remember the same things and reread history together. With the Protestants, it's not just history that divides us, it is doctrine. And so there we try to reread the doctrine. But it, to some extent, it keeps shifting. I mean, the classical magisterial Protestants at the time of the council have developed in ways that are not always helpful to continue the dialogue with ourselves. So you have to just keep listening and keep praying, and there's goodwill. In other words, the advantage is that because of the Vestigia Ecclesiae, they're friends, they're brothers and sisters, they're not enemies. And that's a great advantage. It's psychological, but it's also a spiritual and even theological. The evangelicals, because they share much of our moral teaching, are now easier in some ways to converse with. We don't have to avoid a lot of things. that we do with so-called mainstream Protestants. And so that's wonderful. The disadvantage is that unlike the Protestants who still have the vestigia ecclesiae that are governance, there is no common governance there. So there's no interlocutor. Whom do you talk to? There's no evangelical bishop of Chicago like there's a Lutheran bishop of Chicago or an Episcopal bishop of Chicago. And so there's nobody to talk to. Therefore, we depend upon groups of yourselves, of lay people, to talk, to get together, to even work for social action, but not to be co-opted politically. When the church plays politics, she always loses. It's not our game, we didn't invent it, and we may think that we're getting our way, in the end we lose. So it's faith culture, it's not church state. And we have to give principles for formation of conscience for political action, but we have to be quite careful that we're not just one more social action group based upon something that people recognize as political and therefore can discount. That is to just betray the mission of the church. And that's very hard. It's very hard to work that out. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Try to do your best. But with evangelicals, it's a healthy conversation very often. With others who are not a Christian, then the conversation does change, which you mentioned, culture. The present Pope is quite clear that there is not a lot of theological work that can be done sometimes even with Muslims because the vocabulary isn't there. When we use philosophy consistently, even when it was difficult and it was at times heretical, nonetheless they baptized Aristotle, etc., and went along. The Muslims at a certain point had those intellectual currents and decided to use law rather than reason in order to develop. You have to have something with faith as the vehicle, the rational vehicle. And so they use law. The great schools of Muslim Islamic jurisprudence are the four great schools. They're marvelous. Development of law. It's also an expression of a religion that is a religion of will to some extent. We have tried to stay with reason, and so we have a philosophical theological vocabulary that doesn't have a counterpart. And so we can do some things, but it's difficult. What we can do, though, is again at the local level, we have mosque parish dialogues in Chicago, like we have parish synagogues dialogue. And it's easier with the Jews because salvation is from the Jews. The God that we call the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's a little bit easier. It's less easy with the Muslims who came after, and we can watch them pray, and sometimes they invite us to do that, but we don't pray with them, and they wouldn't want us to, and they certainly don't pray with us. So what do? Well, we talk about living. It's a dialogue of life, and the two topics that you can do with Muslims is you talk about family life and you talk about immigration. And they like to talk to us because we're good on immigration. And we're all immigrants and sons of immigrants, grandsons of immigrants. So they find an audience. The Catholics, you can talk about immigration and what it means to be new in a society that you didn't shape, that you didn't form. And the second thing, that they're horrified when they look at our families. You can criticize their family way of life if you like, et cetera, for different reasons. But nonetheless, they want to keep their families intact. We wouldn't always say you keep them intact the way they seem to do it, but nonetheless, we can have conversations about family life that are really quite. So you find something to share. It's not from God; it's from our own experience, family life, immigration problems, etc. It's the same thing in multicultural Catholic parishes. We share the faith supposedly, but the expression is so different, and the language is different. How do you get to a single parish from two different groups using the same parish buildings? Well, you call them together and you share food and you share music because people like different kinds of music. And pretty soon they're singing songs that are Spanish and vice versa. And they're finding out that these people can cook pretty well. So you share. Communion is based upon relationships through the sharing of gifts. But gifts are of all sorts. The divine gifts, of course, create a supernatural reality. But the human gifts also are helpful. And from that, a lot of other conversations follow. Once you begin a relationship by sharing gifts, they can be all kinds of gifts. So you just have to watch for them. With evangelicals, we have a shared moral theology to a great extent for different reasons, but nonetheless it can be shared. With others, we have a shared liturgical background, you know, with Episcopalians and things like that. Their Book of Common Prayer comes out of the Roman Missal. So, you know, you just look for the things that we partially share and start a relationship based on them. But most of all, we share a belief in God, and so it's prayer that will determine the unity of, you know, the church, as you said, spiritual ecumenism. Yes?
How would you explain the fact that a person who is not yet ordained bishop still may receive jurisdiction for a diocese and has basically all the rights as a bishop except ordaining priests?
Well, that's a big difference. In other words, sacramentally, yeah, we have that right now with prefix apostolic in Catholic communion. So he's the equivalent of a prefect apostolic. And a prefix apostolic, when you don't have a local community that's big enough to be a church, then it becomes a vicar apostolic, but he's a vicar, but he's a bishop, and then it becomes a diocese. So that's not new to the church's governance. To have a priest who is a prefect apostolic, or in this case, an ordinary of this particular personal rite, and that he enjoys jurisdiction, but he can't confirm, well, he could with special permission. A priest can do that too. Any priest can. He can't ordain, certainly not. But he can govern with jurisdiction. But, you know, it's interesting because there the governance doesn't come from the, But it's an exception, you know. But in a sense, that's what all bishops were before the Second Vatican Council, as the theory was that I was saying. So, kind of a throwback. Okay.
Thank you. I think we ran out of time.
Okay, Father Lopez, thank you very much. God bless.